Hey everybody, and welcome to Bandyte's Procedural Texturing and Shading course, to episode 2, where we'll be going over the principled BSDF shader. If you don't know how to get to this point, please check out episode 0.1, 0.2 and 0.3. And in episode 1 you can check out how nodes work. But if you're already familiar with all that kind of stuff, let's jump into the principled BSDF. So a while ago the principled BSDF was dropped, which is basically a physically based shader that has all the normal parameters, let's say, of a physically based shader. So it draws inspiration from game engines like Unreal and Unity with its properties. So potentially we can go make shaders in here and translate them to engine shaders like for Unity or Unreal. And you know, at a later stage we might be doing that. But first, let's check out what the principled shader really is. So we'll go over every and single parameter while keeping our 3D viewport over here to see what's happening. So let's zoom in on this thing. The first parameter says GGX, and if you click it we can also go to multiscatter GGX. This is basically the distribution calculation for the shader. We will very unlikely touch this ever, except if we want to get some nicer results. And I'm not even sure if this has effect on Eevee or just on cycles. The second value is the subsurface method, which has the famous Christensen-Burley for physically based subsurface scattering. And then we have the random walk. The random walk is a pretty straightforward, like it randomly shoots rays and calculates how the subsurface works. But the Christensen-Burley is a method that has some nicer results. Alright, but these two we rarely gonna touch, as said, so we're gonna move on to the first couple of parameters that actually decide how our shader is gonna look. The first one is a base color. This is a color parameter. If we select the color, we get a nice color wheel, and we can just change the color, and you see the color change. So the color wheel has all the colors. By going outside of the wheel, we increase the saturation, and by rotating in the wheel, we change the hue. If you want to change the value, there's a third parameter over here. Of course, we can also check the color parameters over here and the hue, saturation and value, or we can put this to RGB if you want to play with RGB settings. But using the color wheel might be easiest. One pro tip: if you press Shift and move on the color wheel, it is of much laxer kind of lags behind, so you can way more specific with your color without having to move your mouse millimeters at a time. So there you go. So the base color speaks for itself. It's the color of your material. The second one is a subsurface. So what is subsurface exactly? Subsurface is light that enters the material and exits at another point. So skin, or for instance candles, and even maybe rubber to a very light degree, but all materials that do not reflect light 100% have some kind of subsurface scattering. So once we start using materials like that that need that property, we're gonna pump up the subsurface. So this is a value that goes from 0 to 1. And once it is updated, we can see the subsurface in action. We don't see our base color at the moment, because 1 just means he goes full subsurface. In most cases, we want to be somewhere in the lower area. The subsurface radius is a vector that decides which colors get distributed how much. That's in simple terms. So if we change, for instance, if we press Shift and drag, then we can change this. We don't see a lot changing, but the changes are there. If you zoom in on our material and go to the edges here, for instance, if you move this down, you already see some changes. For skin, you might want to leave this on 1.21. And this will mean the red and blue. So this is red, green, and blue. The red and blue will be scattered a lot more than the green values, which will give this a little bit of a flashy tone. Do we work with other materials? We just put this to 111, and it will be more physically in tone with other materials. And we have the subsurface color. So this is not to be confused with what colors get subsurfaced. Put this on 1 again. But this is the actual color of the subsurface material. So pretty straightforward. If you hover over the color here and you go Ctrl C, and then you go over this color and press Ctrl V, you can just put the same color there. Maybe you want to go a little bit more Cedric or in a different color. Depends on which look you want. Maybe increase the subsurface. And then we get like a subsurface material. Okay, moving on. We'll be turning subsurface off again. So we just have a nice flat material again. The next value is the metallic. This one is pretty important. And in most cases, this we want this to be either 0 or 1. 0 means this is not a metallic shader. So this is dielectric actually, which means it's not a metal. So pretty straightforward. But in our physical world, metallic surfaces scatter light differently than dielectric. So for instance, if we have our gizmos turned on up here, we see our shader balls as well down here. If you don't see them, just go to viewport overlays and put the look depth preview on. But here we can see a metallic ball and a what looks like a soft plastic, but it's dielectric. So if we play with this, put it down all the way to metallic, then we see that this has a feel of a chrome ball, like a red chrome ball. Looks pretty nice. For instance, if you turn this to orange, this starts to look like copper, or maybe gold, or maybe like a nice metal. And if you put the metallic down again, it goes back to being plasticky. Are there uses where we want this halfway? Maybe. But as long as we work with like physically based, this doesn't make a lot of sense. But yeah, we can play around with it and see if maybe we do need it. But we'll get there when we get there. So, the second option is the specular. In most cases, we don't want to change the specular, and there's people arguing that actually the best physical correct one is 0.55 as opposed to 0.5, the default value. I don't think there's that much of a difference that is very noticeable. If you change this back to 0.5, you see not change a lot. But what does it do actually? Well, if we turn it off and on, you can actually see the intensity of reflections in there. So with this slider, we can just turn on and off reflections. We might use this if we want to cheat away a material in a scene. Maybe it's reflecting too much and we just don't want to reflect it. But as long as we want to keep things physically accurate and we want to keep it in our shader library, in most cases we want to keep it to 0.5 or 0.55. All right. The second is also a singular value called the specular tint. For this example, I'm gonna make it red again. And what happens if we move up the specular tint is that our specular is actually gonna be more the color of the ball. So we can see here nicely. So we can see here nicely that if I move it down, you can actually see blue in the red ball, which is the reflection of the sky. So the next one is pretty important, is the roughness. And once we start playing with this value, you'll see why. The roughness is how rough is your object. So if we keep this on a very low value, this is almost perfect reflection. It's like a very clean new plastic ball, and it reflects our environment. If we turn it all the way up, then this almost looks like rubber or, you know, a very rough plastic. And it almost looks like a very basic diffuse shader, which it is. I mean, if you put the roughness on 1, it's basically just all diffuse. We can also use this on the metallic, of course. If we move the metallic up, we get a bit more of a rough metallic, you know, like it was brushed. It looks almost like a Christmas ball. Very nice. Now I want to turn metallic down again. I want to keep the roughness somewhere on 0.2 for now. So the next setting are the anisotropic and the anisotropic rotation settings. These are actually used for like brushed metals. Like think of the backside of a pan. It doesn't really reflect, or a cooking pot, but it reflects this in lines and distort it. We'll be going over these examples later, since these are not really used in Eevee at the moment. But we'll keep these two values to 0 for now. The next option is the Sheen option. So Sheen does something very subtle but can be used. If we turn up the roughness up here, this will be more visible. So you see that it actually reflects more on the sides. So if we zoom in here and we move the Sheen down and up and down and up, then we see there's this white reflection on the faces facing away from us. We can use this to add this extra effect to clothing and fabric, and it will make it look a little bit nicer. Also, the Sheen tint is how much of the base color is put on the Sheen. So we can also play with this. We can actually boost the Sheen by going this to 0. I think that's a little bit nicer. But of course, if you have a lot of color, you might want to keep that color in there. So keep that in mind, and we'll be using this for fabric. But in most cases, we want to turn it off. So the next one is the clear coat option. The clear coat is pretty nice since we don't have to add it manually anymore. But it's basically a second shader on top of your shader that it's like an extra layer of reflective material that is added to, for instance, cars. So we're just gonna turn it on and wait for our shader to update. There we go. Now we can see, it's reflective, but it's not taking this roughness. Well, it is on the underlying layer. So now you have an extra reflection layer on top of the normal shader. We can individually choose this roughness for the clear coat. For instance, if you go to metallic, it's become really obvious. If you pump up this roughness, but put this one down, you get something that looks like a nice car shader. It's almost like the reflection is kind of bloomed out, but it's just 2 layers. So if you want to make a car shader, this is the way to go. But we'll go more into detail later. Let's turn off the clear coat for now. So the next 3 options are actually connected to each other. And this is for the transmission. So say we want to make a gloss shader. We can just use the transmission for that. So if you turn this up, you can see this becomes a transmitted object. At the moment, currently, it's only transmitting the HDRI because we haven't enabled physically based transmission in our render settings. But in most cases, if you really want to do that physically accurate, we're going to use a gloss shader anyway. But this might be nice for like smaller objects that it just needs this translucent feel. So we can change the IOR. The IOR is the index of refraction. And if we move this to 1, this becomes just see-through, right? It's not even like glass, it's like air basically. Air has an index of refraction of 1. If we go to glass, it's 1.45 if I'm not mistaken. And it's basically how the light refracts within the object. And if we go, for instance, to water, if I'm not mistaken, it's 1.55. Do correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. But yeah, and then it just looks like a water droplet. So the standard is set on 1.5. We can also set the roughness for the transmission. So that's basically how much the transmission is roughed. But this works in cycles only. So currently not in Eevee. But also this, we're not going to use super lot, maybe a little bit. Can add something nice and magical to an object. I want to turn this off. Next one is an emission, which is a color. Its default is on black, so it doesn't give any emission. But if you turn this to white, our object becomes emissive. So it just, you know, creates light. Let's put our value of our emission even higher. Let's put it on 2. Now you can really see it. That's really nice. You can make it a specific color. Is this red or blue, or like blue? And that gives off a blue light. This will be very handy because we can put masks in here that if some parts of a shader need to be glowing, giving off light, we can use this. So this is a nice addition to the principled BSDF. So the next one we can check out is the alpha. The alpha also only works in cycles. And if we go to cycles and go to rendered view, you can clearly see what it does. It just makes your object transparent. Like it just turns down the opacity. So this can be used to cheat some translucency or transparency, but I think you're better off with the gloss shader. And this might have some other uses as well. If you're making objects for games, you can put in an alpha to check out like the alpha of a texture, for instance. So it's a nice addition. So the last 3, as you can see, are blue nodes. So these are vector nodes. And I'll be discussing the first 2 for now, because playing with the tangent value will be for very specific materials, and we will not use now. So then we have 2 normal inputs left. Normals are extra information you give to the shader for depth and relief. So if we go, I can best explain this with an example. Go to the noise texture, press Ctrl-Shift, click. You can see this creates a nice noise texture. Let's put the settings like this. And then we can use in the vector settings, so these are nodes with vector outputs, a bump. So we can put the vector, which is just a black and white value of the noise, into the height. And it will create a vector image that has this as an output. If you put this in a normal, and we preview our shader, and put the strength down a bit, then this looks like, you know, a muddy ball. So of course, this will be very essential for making shaders, since we don't want to put all the details into modeling, because then our objects become just way too detailed. So we'll be using the bump map to fake some relief on the surface. The clear coat normal is the same thing just for the clear coat, because as you see, if we turn on the clear coat, then the normal bump map doesn't have any effect on it. So if we go back to our look dev here, we can see there is a relief, but our clear coat is still clean. So it looks really like a gloss layer over a rock. But of course, we can also put this in the clear coat normal, and then even our clear coat will have this relief on it. It looks very nice. So these are basically all the values for the principled BSDF that you need to know. So if in any tutorial you're confused about what it does again, come back to this tutorial and I will explain it to you. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time, and yeah, keep on shading.